Telltale Midnight presents a Halloweekly production, The Ladykiller, written by Jenny Beres. The bright blue washcloth dripped dingy gray water down the baby's back as Kristen propped him up with one hand and sponged over him with the other. Her arms bled slightly. Tiny puncture wounds where two small teeth sunk themselves into her flesh were the only evidence there had been a struggle. Barely noticeable except for the sting of dirty water and cheap drugstore shampoo. How many hours had they been in this bathroom now? God was finally with them, though the blacked-out windows and dark brown curtains implied that the presence she felt was anyone but that of a savior. Kristen soaped up Max's curly dark hair and whispered into his ear, "It's time to say our prayers." She placed the baby's chubby, wrinkled hands into hers, and the weight of his waterlogged limbs made it difficult to hold his fingers in place. But she couldn't send his soul to heaven, not without an explanation. He had a message to give to God, and in that message, Kristen hoped that the one who could right all wrongs would find a spot on his cross for her. "Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be thy name." As she whispered her prayer into his paper-thin ear, she couldn't resist a nibble. She bit down a little harder today, knowing he wouldn't scream. In 10 minutes, his father would be home, and she'd have to show him what she'd done. The suds lathered into colorful bubbles on the baby's head, and tears caught in Kristen's throat, remembering the day she found out she was going to be a mother. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." But being a mother wouldn't be God's will after all. Her penance for forcing life where it was never meant to be was death. It was at his christening party she realized just how grim her duty to protect her son would be. It was at that party when Marissa didn't show up. It was in the kitchen, getting ready to serve cake to 50 hungry guests, most who just sat through their first church service in over a decade, that she turned to Jack, filled with new mother concern. Where was their nanny? Where was Marissa? "I don't know, hun," Jack shrugged. "Teenagers are unreliable." Marissa was not unreliable. Unreliable teenagers don't hold the hands of a woman they barely know when their water breaks and their husband can't be found. Unreliable teenagers don't stop by every day for a week after class to bring you books on why it's normal to feel disconnected and little packages of European chocolate. Girls like Marissa just don't disappear. They're stolen. The faucet sputtered a surprise shot of scalding water, burning Kristen back to reality, back to her bathroom. She spun the spigot closed and forced herself to look at the bruised, blue, and broken baby in her arms. She'd been bathing him for hours. Max loved bath time, but she had no idea what a fighter he'd be until she tightened her hands around his tiny throat and held him under. The only witness, a ratty rubber duck from her own miserable childhood. Kristen turned the water back on. She still hadn't washed his feet. "Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we have forgiven our debtors." But she hadn't forgiven her debtors. She hadn't forgiven Jack at all. As the blue washcloth made its way between Max's tiny baby toes, Kristen thought of all the times Jack looked away from her, all the times she only wanted his attention. But he was busy, always preoccupied. His hobbies were hunting, both animals and women. Then one night, Kristen saw it for herself. She was in the kitchen, the baby asleep, struggling to make something for dinner since he hadn't given her any more than $10 in the last 2 weeks. He barked about his food and his contributions to their family. She moved past him, down the back stairs and to the garage, hoping to find some meat from last year's season left in the freezer. As she stepped into the garage, her body froze. On the outside of Jack's car, a red-stained clump of blonde hair. Holding her breath, Kristen tiptoed her way to the trunk of the car. A shred of pink flannel was caught in the trunk door, just large enough for Kristen to feel the vomit rise in her throat. Jack was waiting for her at the top of the stairs. She tried to move past him, but he shoulder-checked her, hard. "What are you doing?" he growled. Kristen held up the blood-stained white paper wrapped around old deer meat. "Dinner." Jack stepped aside, unconvinced but hungry. On the stove, Kristen did her best to concoct a gravy and a few salvageable potatoes that didn't smell like vinegar from the bottom of the pantry. Who did that pink flannel belong to? As she prepared the deer, she found patches of fur he hadn't cleaned. Where had he hunted down this girl? She had to get back to the trunk. When they sat down to eat, Kristen did her best to smile just enough so he wouldn't suspect anything and keep drinking the beers she was handing him, hoping to knock him out long enough to find his car keys. After an hour, she got her wish. The TV droned on, but not loud enough to drown out Jack's snoring. The keys were hooked to his belt in plain sight. Kristen took a deep breath and her chest cavities shook. Dread filled her shoes, making each step heavier than the next as she crept towards him. His sour breath, hot on the tip of her nose, reminded her that this was the closest she'd been to him since Max was conceived. She slipped one finger through the belt loop and the other on the metal clasp. She could have sworn he could hear her tremble, but he didn't. The keys loosened their hold from his belt and fell into Kristen's fingers. Every creak in the kitchen floor made her heart stop as she made her way back to the stairs and down to the garage. Tonight, she would see all the other women he spent his time with, all the other girls he liked better than her. The ones the newspapers would call a victim and shed tears over, while her husband treated them better for one night than she'd been treated for their entire marriage. That was the tricky thing about Jack. For a few hours or a few dates, he was charming and rugged. But he had a short expiration date, and he had spoiled on Kristen's shelf a long time ago. With a click, she turned the trunk key, cursing any noise it made as she lifted the metal latch. She prayed that she wouldn't vomit. The trunk popped open. It was empty. Kristen sighed a breath of disbelief and another of relief. But when she lowered the trunk door, there was Jack's face. Beet red, liquored up, and ready for a fight. He didn't say anything when he grabbed her neck and slammed her face against the back of the car. Kristen wailed and he dug his fingers into the center of her ponytail, latching onto her skull and pulling her back into the house. Jack dragged her across the kitchen floor towards the basement door. Kristen thrashed, her back legs scraping against every exposed nail on the wooden stairs as Jack kicked her down the remaining 4 steps, a bloody heap trying to catch her breath between sobs. Kristen hit the floor and heard an echo. She wasn't the only one trying to catch her breath down here. When she looked up, there she was, blood trickling down the side of her face and down the front of her pink flannel shirt. Tied up in a rocking chair Kristen inherited from her grandma. "What were you doing snooping in my car?" Jack roared and stumbled over to her. Kristen sat up to answer, but before she could get a word out, Jack kicked her back down. "I know what'll fix you." He approached the girl, a sweet-looking stranger who was nothing more than the wind in an intimate high-wire act between 2 people she'd never met. Jack knelt beside her, and the girl began hyperventilating so fast, Kristen thought the gag in her mouth was going to shoot down her throat and suffocate her on the spot. Jack locked eyes with Kristen, and she couldn't look away when he bent down and kissed the girl's cheek. The pang in Kristen's gut was too much. She couldn't help it. "What the fuck are you doing to me?" she screamed. Jack didn't strike her this time. Instead, he smiled. "You're jealous." The words stung. Of course she was jealous. Even as she faced down the monster in front of her, the man he'd revealed himself to be, she would always want his attention, always love him first, even if it disgusted her, even if that meant betraying what she knew was right. If Jack had spent even one moment looking at Kristen the way he looked at the girl roped to the chair, they may have never found themselves in this mess, in this basement at all. Kristen wanted to wrap her newly found maternal arms around the whimpering girl and get her to safety. And yet, Jack had spent more time with her tonight than he had with Kristen since the baby was born. Another whore of a girl who had no business coming between them. Guilt washed over her, her conscience teetering on what was sane and decent and what she really felt. Her body shook so hard she thought her bones would rattle themselves right out of her skin. "You're going to let her go. Whatever the fuck your problem is, it is not her. Let her go." Her voice was a hoarse whisper, but she knew Jack heard her. From upstairs, the baby monitor crackled, giving away her ace. Kristen's head whipped around instinctually at the sound of muffled cooing. She had to survive, or Max would die. Jack followed her eyes up the stairs. His baritone voice was even-tempered. I have you by the balls. How about you're gonna do whatever the fuck it is I tell you to do, or that miracle baby of yours is never going to wake up again. Tears streamed down Kristen's face, but not as many as she expected. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was shock, but now Kristen knew this wasn't the first time a girl died in her basement. She thought back to her nanny Marissa and imagined her tied to one of those forgotten chairs, while Kristen made dinner or obliviously played patty cake just one helpless floor above. But despite knowing the horrific truth, Kristen also knew she wasn't going to have a hard time choosing between her son and this stranger, no matter how unfair to the girl that was. Jack's glassy blue eyes turned to the girl and back to Kristen. He handed her a knife, and behind the gag, the girl in the pink plaid thrashed, her eyes begging for some mercy from the one mother in the room, the mother now holding the knife. Joggers, Jack said. How many years have they been warning you women not to run alone? The knife shook so hard in Kristen's hand that she dropped it 3 times before it made its way messily to the young girl's throat. The sound of a fatal cut was quieter than she imagined, and the flawless skin ripping beneath her hand jolted her alive, filling her with an odd sense of calm. Her only regret was that she couldn't have been tidier about the girl's suffering. But Jack had a point. Out there in the dark, enticing other women's husbands in tight yoga pants and fitted sports bras, who did she think she was? The knife cut just an inch deeper. Kristen collapsed to the ground sobbing. She did it. She saved her son. And with that, she rescued her marriage from another intrusion. Jack stepped back. Kristen wiped the warm blood from her face and studied his eyes. He looked different. He smiled a smile she hadn't seen since the year she married him, before he started working late and sleeping on the couch. Headlights appeared and shook Kristen from her memory. The water was now ice cold. The suds gone. It was time to finish the prayer. As she wrapped the baby in a towel, she whispered, "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Jack was home. The bathroom door was locked, but Jack would have no problem kicking it in. That was fine. She was ready to show him there was nothing he could take from her. She had taken it away from herself. He could kill her, or he could set this whole goddamn house on fire and burn them both to ash, but there was nothing left to hold over her head. The garage door creaked open. Kristen shuddered, knowing that ever since he thought they were in this together, the girls became more frequent, the kills more violent, each time threatening to murder their child if she refused to kill. His voice called up from the stairs. "Chris? Brought us home dinner," he said. An order for her to appear, to sit pretty and eat whatever he gave her. Kristen cradled Max in one arm and tucked a buck knife into her pocket. With a deep breath, she opened the bathroom door and made her way down the hall to the nursery. She tucked Max under his blanket, the top of the covers hiding his face and barely covering his curls. She set the mobile, like she did every night, and kissed him on the cheek. Her fingers still fondling the buck knife in her pocket, she headed downstairs. Ever since the first time she did his killing, he started to look at her again. He didn't stop looking at them, of course. These girls still made their way into their home, and as far as Kristen saw it, between them. But now she could end it whenever it started to be too much for her to stomach. Jack met her at the landing and kissed her forehead. "Hey, babe." Once, she would have melted. Now, she only stood frozen. "Hi, honey." "Where's the baby?" Kristen stiffened. "I put him down early." Jack gave her a squeeze on the thigh, and even that hurt. Good girl. They sat across each other at the table. Between them, 2 buckets of chicken and a side of greens. Kristen listened to him drone on about his day, laying asphalt, while faintly she could hear the baby's mobile playing lullabies from upstairs, lulling to sleep a baby who was already forever asleep. No matter how hard she searched her heart for guilt, she just couldn't conjure it. Max had been a miracle baby, a product of years of struggle. All that time, God said no, but in the end, not even God could stop her from getting what she wanted. What was most likely a divine warning was now her hell. Jack smiled, a little bit of food stuck in his stubble, and placed his hand on hers. "What are you thinking about?" "How handsome you are," Kristen said, and it took everything she had not to knife him in the heart right then and there. "I brought us something for dessert." His eyes flickered. Her stomach sunk. Somewhere on this property there was some pretty girl, a runner or a waitress, a lonely girl lured away from the light by Jack. She'd see Kristen and be filled with a last ounce of hope that the wife would have some compassion, some courage, and a plan to outsmart her husband long enough to rescue them both. But nobody in this house was worth saving. Not Kristen, not Jack, not Baby, and certainly not the girl. Still, Kristen was free, the bargaining chip dead. Her fingers fumbled around the buck knife in her pocket. Her mind trailed back to all the times she watched Jack bleed a doe in just one swift motion. He leaned his head back to laugh at his own joke, and Kristen traced the outline of his Adam's apple with her eye. Just like cutting fruit. Her fingers let go of the knife, and she took a sip of water and decided to laugh. His joke was just funny enough. After dinner, when the stars started to sparkle, he took her hand. "Let's go to the shed." They made their way back into the backyard, and Kristen followed Jack's lead down the moonlit path to the shed at the back of their property. A tiny light glowed from inside. She took a deep breath and opened the door. Kristen's eyes widened and her stomach dropped. "What is this?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. In front of her was a small table with 2 chairs, candlelight, and a bottle of champagne. Soft jazz replaced the lullabies coming from the baby monitor in Kristen's pocket. Jack pulled out a chair for her. "Don't tell me you forgot our anniversary, Mrs. Conrad." Kristen sat, not because she wanted to, but because she was going to pass out. Instead of a woman gagged and bound, there was a cake on the table. Jack poured 2 glasses of champagne. "To the mother of my child, love of my life, partner in crime," Jack said with a wink. He handed Kristen her glass. She gulped it down. "Where is she?" Jack murmured. "Never thought you'd get into my hobbies, but now I can hardly keep your hands off them, can I?" He stroked her hair with a touch that chilled her insides. Kristen smiled weakly. The tooth marks on her arms began to sting. "So, where is she?" Beads of sweat dripped down her face. "Babe, it's our anniversary. You're the only lady in my life tonight." Kristen's cheeks flushed hot, then cold, and she closed her eyes to keep from fainting. All she could see in the back of her eyelids was Max's chubby baby smile when she scooped him and his ducky up for their last bath. "There's supposed to be a girl here tonight," Kristen said hoarsely. Her voice tightened like a frayed rope around her throat. "Well, there's not." Jack eyed her suspiciously. Kristen's anger boiled so hot her eyes burned in their sockets. She watched Jack cut the cake, a vanilla mascarpone, the same kind her mother had made for their wedding. Her baby was dead, some random girl who should be here tonight was alive, and Jack was cutting them cake. There wasn't supposed to be cake. Sometimes our rage dries up. She blinked. "What does that mean?" Jack sighed. "Some of us die, and that's why we disappear. Some of us move. But some of us, we work out our shit. We rediscover what it is we were missing, and the risk each time becomes less and less worth it." He ran his hand down Kristen's cheek. The room spun. His words made her lightheaded. She wanted to run back to the house and breathe life back into her baby. But she couldn't do that because she had already smothered it away. "But what about our hobby?" Kristen asked. He shook his head and lifted a forkful of cake into his mouth. "We'll find a new one." "A new one," Kristen echoed. Jack leaned back in his chair, proud of what he thought to be his reformation. "Sure, we could be like normal couples. Go see movies, have people over for dinner. Though we'd have to clean up the place a bit first," he chuckled. "Can't have our guests stumbling across bits like this." He picked up a gold charm bracelet, its shine dull from old blood. No, that was all Kristen could squeak out. Okay, so we don't have people over. Jack leaned back, relaxed. Everything has a season, babe. This season was meant to, I don't know, reunite our family, I think. Kristen lunged. She didn't know what happened first. Did Jack scream, or did she ram the buck knife from her pocket and into his temple before he could make a sound? She didn't know. She didn't care. She just needed him to shut up. His blood splattered, and she could taste it all over her face and tongue as she dragged the reluctant knife, heavy with blood and brain matter, out of his head and plunged it back in. Never giving Jack the second to respond, never giving him the luxury of surprise. Her only regret was that she didn't get to tell him that Max was dead. With each plunge of the knife, she thought of her baby, of how Jack had ruined their family, how he had killed their son, how all those women who enticed him every day, they were the ones to blame. Kristen pulled the knife from Jack's head. His body fell to the ground, leaking like a squashed, spoiled fruit. She wiped the knife against her shirt and leaned over him. His t-shirt, for once, was soaked with his own blood and not someone else's. She cut herself a fresh slice of cake. 2 years later. The smell of burned apples singed the house. As the baby giggled from her high chair, Kristen set the amateur pie on a trivet and looked at the clock. Dan would be home any moment. She brushed the baby's blonde curls from her eyes and kissed her cheek so ferociously, with so much gratitude for her second life, that the baby screamed. Dan walked past the mums that Kristen planted that spring, past the swing set that Julia would be old enough to enjoy next summer. He sighed at the perfection of this life with his new wife. Kristen had laid out a feast: rolls, brisket, salad, and homemade apple pie. Tonight was a celebration of 2 years together. The front door opened. "Where are my girls?" Dan's voice boomed from down the hall. Kristen scooped the baby under one arm and greeted her husband with a lingering kiss and a sigh. He snuggled into her face and grabbed the baby, tossing her roly-poly body into the air and into a fit of laughter. They made their way to the kitchen, and Dan closed his eyes, breathing it all in. "Damn it, Kristen, this smells unbelievable." He propped Julia up in her high chair, while Kristen fiddled with the tablecloth, poured 2 iced teas, and began carving the meat. Concern spread across her face. "What's wrong?" Dan asked, worried that any crack in her happiness would cause their entire lives to shatter. "I forgot the fresh thyme." Dan shrugged and shoveled a forkful of roast into his mouth. "Nah, it doesn't need it. It's delicious." "It's a 2-second fix." She smiled brightly and grabbed her gardener's basket and headed out the door. The setting sun blinded Kristen as she stepped onto the back porch and out towards her small patch of garden, her respite from being a perfect mom and born-again wife. She knelt in the dirt where the thyme wildly grew around a statue of the Virgin Mother, who reminded her that what God was willing to give her, he was also willing to brutally take away. She thought of Max, and she hoped somewhere he knew that he was still her savior, and that she had been his. Kristen pushed the cool dirt back and forth with her hands, her eyes never leaving the purity of the mother before her, occasionally pulling up a weed and mixing it with her basket of herbs. Nothing was perfect. Nothing was pure. Not even the fruits of her garden. As she rooted around under the dirt, her hands stumbled across something spongy and wet. An arm with a man's wristwatch surfaced from the soil. Dan's voice echoed from the house. "Babe, your dinner's getting cold." Kristen pushed the decaying arm back under the soil and smoothed over the dirt. She could tend to her hobbies later. She was not Jack. Her family would always come first. We hope you enjoyed this original production of The Ladykiller, presented by Telltale Midnight, produced by Halloweekly. Copyright 2017 by Jenny Beres.